Good morning, everyone. Welcome. This is Angela Coulter and
Sarah Sieg Avignoni.
bringing you this week's Living Ascension. And on Halloween, what else could we talk about than the dun dun dun?
Right. As my dogs bring their squeaky toy in. Like, oh, it's a party.
It's a party. Look, it's funny. I have my black cat switch on. I'm like, okay, I have my Merlin eye. It's like, we should put that up here for the third eye. Right there.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'll make it tighter. Good morning, Yasmin. So yeah, what a great topic. And it was funny because we had an entirely other topic, like in line. So that'll be next week. And this came up and it was like, well, of course we're doing this on Halloween. It would be perfect to talk about the shadow. So you hear about that all the time. Well, not all the time, but you do hear about that in the spiritual and consciousness community. You hear the term shadow work and have you done your shadow work and like da. And most people are like, oh yeah, I did that on Sunday afternoon and check that.
Right.
Except
or I really don't feel that applies to me.
Oh, yes. That's a real common one is, oh yeah, no, I don't have that. I don't have to do that.
I don't have that.
I'm good. And it's so funny because as soon as people say that to me, I'm like, well, then there's something like, oh yeah, no, don't want to look at that.
There's that shadow side right there.
The shadow right there just came popping right out. So today we are just going to invite it in, give it a big hug, and thank it for it being there. Because, so from a consciousness standpoint, the shadow is that whole thing that we created in duality, right? When we created the me and not me, right? It's the perception of not me, which created a shadow, right? Which would then, because it would create this depth and this reflection back to us of what's inside and pretending that it's outside. So when we talk about it in terms of consciousness, we talk about it in terms of like ego and the quest for separation and identity, which isn't bad. It just is, right? But we do often deem it bad.
Well, we judge it.
Yes.
We judge it, and we judge it to where that's what creates the separation, is the judgment.
And then we create more of it by judging it, right? So we create more separation. And then, so it's like, okay. And then we talk about what we call the ego's energies, which are, fear, anxiety, shame, guilt, doubt, anger, resentment, envy, all that kind of stuff, right? All having to do with the not me and creating.
Or, I always think of it as I want to be a good person.
Right.
So I relegate all these things that I judge as bad into the shadows.
Right. And so when you look at Carl Jung and Jungian psychology, which is a big little corridor of psychology, right? Carl Jung did a whole bunch of stuff about the shadow and talked about where the shadow comes from, which, it ties in so perfectly into what we're talking about, just from a different explanation and standpoint, which is why I wanted to bring it in, is where, the shadow are the things that we repress about ourselves. And in Jungian psychology, it's how we suppress the parts of ourselves that are not up to the standard that we're taught is supposed to be, right? So we're taught this in one way, shape, or form, whether it's by our families, by our, culture, by our beliefs, all that kind of stuff that we say, and we're constantly judging, we're constantly comparing. And in our minds, it's like, well, if I don't like this, or I don't feel like I should do this, then I should be ashamed of myself because I'm not agreeing with that standard. And so that shame, what I'm ashamed about, I'm going to put into the shadow, and I'm going to put it into the closet. Right. And
in doing it so thoroughly, we squash it down to the point where it becomes unconscious.
And it runs the thing is, we think that we put it in the closet, but it's actually the one at the steering wheel when it's unconscious, it's driving us.
It's the
It
driver's
causes,
seat. Exactly.
right. And then that's where, if we go back to talking about like what we talked about last week about our passions, well, then we say, this is my passion. And yet it can be driven completely by the shadow and the lack of being able to, like acknowledge it. Right. So what happens is the more shame we get, the more we suppress it, but then the more it drives us, because the more it wants to push itself into our wholeness, right? Because we're lacking our wholeness, because we're pushing that outside of ourselves. So it's
which we can then tie it back even further into what we've talked about the masculine and the feminine, about how, okay, I'm incarnated right here, right now in the female body. So I judged those characteristics about myself that society and my belief tends to think is more masculine. So I'm going to judge that, and I'm going to say, oh, but that's not who I am, and put that in the closet. And then it turns into, that's actually what's driving me.
Right. And not only that, but it's also what you judge the most in others around you. Right.
Yes. Which is simply an attraction of this is what I came here to look at.
Right. So, let's give examples, because there's so many of them, and it's a challenge for many to see around to that. Right. So being, okay. Let's talk about the traditional feminine, right? Like because we're going the feminine, the masculine, right? And it's like, okay, so what do people teach girls? Be polite, be, soft-spoken, be, like have your manners, be upstanding, play nice, right? Be giving, blah, 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 right? And if they
be attractive,
oh, I'm sorry. How can I forget that? Because that's what the main thing around.
Pay attention to how you dress, your looks. Are you soft?
Mm-hmm. Are you feminine? Right.
And are you non-intimidating?
Right. And oh, by the way, like let's say somebody's growing up in a household where that's what you're taught. Well, then it's like, okay, you're and every time you act the way I want you to, like be feminine and soft-spoken and polite, I will reward you with my love.
Right.
And if you don't act that way, I will punish you and make you think you're a bad person for being that way. Right. So then what happens to that individual is they put it in the closet. They put the assertive side to themselves in the closet, right? The side,
whether it's their desire to play football.
Right.
Or use power tools
or just dress in sweats and not wear any makeup and not care about their hair,
and cut their hair short,
cut their hair really short, like, and be a tomboy, right? Like, which is how, we used to, in our generation, they used to call it, right? So it's like, so then they put that in and not only then they put it in the closet, but if it gets pushed in and repressed long enough, then they grow up to be this, okay, this is like, the epitome of this is my feminine, I'm being the feminine person because that's what makes me valuable in love. And any other female who does not exhibit this way, I'm going to judge as what's the matter with you? Like, why?
And I'm going to resent society for not rewarding me for just being that. Right. Like I got at home.
So there's your shadow. So your shadow is the shame that you have of the not standard that you're given in society, right? By not like, because the part of you that is more assertive and doesn't want to wear makeup and wants to have the short hair and wear, suits instead or pants instead of skirts, like, which was the older generation, but like things like that. Play with, like play in sports instead of, whatever is considered feminine. So it's a lot more blurred today, but not that much, because you still have a big like focus on what it's a girl supposed to look like. A girl supposed
and we can even tie this back to our passions. So what if your passion is multifaceted? and it is a blend of that masculine and feminine, and you've so judged those masculine characteristics and traits, but yet you're constantly drawn to the passion of this, but yet you won't allow that fullness of yourself to be expressed through that passion. So you find yourself drawn to this, but continually frustrated at your belief that you're failing at your passion because
Right.
you aren't allowing that integration.
Right. Well, and if you want to flip it on the other side, the unconscious passion, right, then could be, oh, well, then I decide I'm going to be something like in fashion or in, makeup and, like in whatever, so that I can make sure that women look feminine. Because if they're not living up to being a female. So there's the shadow running your passion, right? And or there's 1,000 other things, but that's just sort of what comes to mind because we're being very, very stereotypical, like in trying to, give an example. So let's flip that around on the masculine side, right? For boys. What are boys taught when they were kids?
Well, they've got to be rough and tumble.
Right. Not only that is they have an excuse because they are victims to their testosterone, right? They can be wild and unkempt and, but depending on what family you grew up in, it depends on how a man is supposed to act, right? You never cry, you don't do this, or, you act this way.
The emotions.
Right. That's the big one, right? Because those
Suck it up, be a man.
Right. Those are, don't cry like a girl. Right.
Or don't throw a ball like a girl.
Right. Or run like a girl. Right. Or things like that. Right. Yeah. How many times have you heard that? So like a boy is brought up with that over and over and over and over. And so in their mind, they equate anything that has to do with emotion or being like you can't play with dolls. Oh my goodness. I remember when my kids were growing up, I had friends once that the mom was very equal, and both her daughter and son could play with whatever, but the dad was very he was pretending he was okay with it, but when she got her son a Barbie doll, he was like,
I draw the line here. Right. It's okay if his little action figures are Star Wars or firemen.
Right, but not a Barbie doll.
But it can't be a mom and a baby and a family.
Right. Or, God forbid, the boy wants to dress up in a dress or as a princess or a fairy or something like that.
Or
right?
makeup.
Right. Or makeup. And so that's what our society teaches. So this is what we're talking about in the Jungian standpoint from the psychology. It's the, okay, so then the boy grows up to think that anything like that, he's not allowed to like. So that's put in the closet. He's not allowed to have emotion. He's not allowed to be sensitive. He's not allowed to like girly things, like what's considered girly, right? And so then what does he do? He grows up and he criticizes other men who are more comfortable in their own skin,
right?
And being emotional and liking makeup or, feminine clothes or whatever. Because that's the judgment that's being projected because the shadow is driving him unconsciously. And then again, it could be this passion of, how to, something very manly. It's got to be a manly kind of, passion to make sure that it helps others do that because that's not good enough because that's what he was taught and he believes. So it's those are examples of letting the shadow run you.
Right.
Unconsciously.
Well, and in your body's and your energy's desire to come back to that wholeness and come back to that balance, you're constantly attracting things that give you the opportunity to do it differently, to embrace that balance. And, as in the Jungian quote, it's we call it fate. We call that unconscious attraction fate because it's saying, I'm here for you. You need to look at me and I hate to use the word use, but look at me and see the value, see the beauty and the harmony in this balance.
Yes. And so when we welcome in the shadow, right? When we welcome it in and we say, thank you so much, because it's held all these things in a big bucket for us.
Right, right.
That's when we actually are able to start unpacking the motivations of a lot of things that we've been very confused about within ourselves often, right, as adults, and everything. And like, well, why was I driven to do that? Or why have I always judged that? So what happens is, the first thing is say, okay, so what am I ashamed of? And often to ask yourself what you're ashamed of, it takes a lot of work to even get an answer because we repress it so much.
Well, and so much has to do with what you want to believe about yourself.
Right. Well, because of what you've been told, it makes a good person. What makes you valuable, right? Again, back to your parents, culture, belief systems, / religions, whatever. TV, right? Oh, commercials, right?
Right. Which is nothing but marketing of manipulation as
psychology.
You need this so that I can have your money.
Well, but what I'm going to tell you is you need this to make yourself loved, to make yourself happy, make yourself, like desirable, or have made it, right? We were talking,
or even, lately, to be healthy.
Right.
Because you should be afraid of death.
Right. And so, like in consciousness, it's like, okay, so that's where the shadow work begins. So this is a very big crossover with psychology and consciousness and spirituality.
Right.
It's a big stepping stone in terms of our own growth and evolution, because first of all, it's the first step is, what am I ashamed of? What am I ashamed of showing about myself to the world?
Right.
And I've said,
where am I trying to hide that I feel less than?
Right. And it's very tricky. It's a very tricky thing, because as it's been pushed into the unconscious in many cases, we could spend, I mean, when we get past the shadow stuff, then there's nothing else, because it's all been cleared out, because we have nothing driving us unconsciously anymore, kind of thing.
Right. And then it becomes a question of, then you can allow your passions to drive you. You can, you have a more even playing field of what's my guidance, because the shadow's not overriding that.
Right.
And you can come to a place of really connecting in with that authentic resonance that, we have a whole podcast on, and getting to that place of I have all of this to choose from. So what do I choose? And that to me is, at first it's a little scary, because you have to get to that place of trusting.
Right. Well, and it's beyond even trusting. You have to get to the place of being able to look at it. Right. So the one day a year.
Absolutely. That's
the first. One day a year, we take it out off the shelf, dust it off, and put it up for the world to see, is on Halloween, when we're like, yeah, I want to watch the slasher movies, because the more blood, the better. And,
right. Well, and, we let the ghosts out of the closet, and we put them in our front yard.
Yes. Yes. And so,
we all wear makeup.
Right. And sometimes it's to reflect the inner demon, right? Or so to speak, the inner demon is just your shadow. It's just your shadow. Right. And so we do celebrate it. And it's funny how as time goes on, it's become more and more celebrated, like more and more celebrated on, like being able to be, dark and spooky, and like haunted houses, like the haunted house, like, that people set up to go through as like an amusement, and, things like that. And it's like, well, what if we just took also this day to celebrate that shadow and say, okay, let's have some tea. Let's have some tea together, or maybe some cider.
Well, and simply say, okay, I acknowledge that all of this is part of me.
Right.
And, you know, I did that Friday after we had our conversation, and you sent me an article, and it says, you know, that the shadow is simply parts of me that I don't acknowledge.
Right.
And in doing so, I mean, it really brought up a lot of stuff and a lot of self-judgment and a lot of surprisingly things that I felt were pretty innocuous. I was like, oh, I've never really looked at it that way. And oh, I've never seen it in those terms. And I mean, it's, and then the self-judgment, like, well, why did I do that?
Well, yeah. Well, and that's the thing to be aware of, right? Because when we do finally take it out and have tea with it, the shadow, and we start looking at some things, we are sometimes appalled in judgment of things that we know exist within us, right? But the thing is, the first,
and appalled at my treatment of it.
right? Well, yeah, like both sides, right? So you're appalled it's there, and then you're appalled that you deny yourself at the same time, right? And so, you know, people go, well, you know, like we all have. So people say, well, you know, I have this thought about whatever. Well, I don't know. Let me think of something, you know, like, here's one. I was so angry about this person parking like in 2 spots in the parking lot that I wanted to key their car. Right. I mean, I've heard people say things like that, right? We've all had days like that. We've all had days like that, right? And when you look at something like that, right, and you go, well, that's horrible. Like, why would I do that? Because if somebody ever did that to me, I would be, you know, appalled.
And you don't know the circumstances of why they parked that way. Maybe it was somebody else was parked funny and they did the best they could.
Right. So instead of, so like when you look at that and say, well, like that's just a bad energy or bad emotion or whatever, you say, no, well, where did that come from? That came from the shadow. What's in the shadow that caused you to want to project? Like, what made you feel so bad about whatever they did that you wanted to project it onto them because it was inside of you, right? And it's like, well, because I would never do something like that. I would never, like, blah, blah, blah. Because, well, when you say I would never, that means because I'm a better person than that, because I'm valuable. And there you go into the shame. Because if I wasn't, it would be shameful, right? That's where you hit the shame part. And so that's a key. And it's so hidden. See how hidden that was? It's like 5 steps, right? And you're going, well, I was just in a bad mood.
Right.
Well,
or
no,
that just really triggered me.
Well, it really triggered me. Well,
without looking at
why it triggered you.
What's behind the trigger. Exactly.
Right. And
well,
so,
you know, especially lately, things have been coming into my creation of feeling like things aren't fair. It's just unjust. And it's like, okay, so where am I judging what's just or fair or right or wrong? And, you know, boiling that down to feeling that lack.
Oh, yeah. And the fair thing that has so many layers, right? Because that's another one. It's like, well, because you're taught that you have to be fair, right? You're taught you have to be fair to be a good person and valuable.
Or you believe something and it turns into, well, it actually wasn't true. So you feel foolish. That's been one recently.
Right.
Feeling the fool. And then it's like, you want to just do something so you eliminate the feeling of ever being foolish, which means you don't want to believe anybody.
Right. But then instead of looking at, so why do I feel foolish? Why did I create that? Like, why?
Or why do I judge the feeling of foolishness?
Right. And so, like, where have I felt? So this is where it gets sticky, because we don't want to look at it. We don't want to look beyond that. We just want to look like the victim and say, I was made to look like a fool.
Well, and that alleviates all responsibility, which, you know, we keep touching on all our courses. We've got trust.
Well, you have an entire course on self-responsibility. Right. And we have a course on the shadow. We have an entire course on shadow work.
Right.
that we would love for you to embark on with us. And so come on over to our Wonderland, come on over to Living Ascension, and we can fill you in on that. But there's so much, and instead of saying, okay, so what do I believe about being foolish? Right.
Right. How do I judge being the fool?
Right. And like,
whether it's me or someone else.
Right. And what does that come from? That comes from see, and it's so funny because even my ego is going, no. Like, no, we don't want to look past that.
We don't want to look too closely at that.
Yeah. No, it's funny because I'm like, wait, I just had the whole picture and it just totally flew out of my head. It's like, no, we don't want to talk about that. This is what we
I'll draw the curtain back, but not all of it. I'll leave the sheer there so I can still not see it fully.
Oh, oops, did the curtain fall down again?
Right.
But it's and so with the thing is to be committed to the shadow as much as we are committed to the light, right? We're committed to, because the commitment to seeing our shadow and to allowing it up into our consciousness, because it allows us to really start figuring out the puzzle of what is making us tick because of all of those unconscious things. So that's why when we commit to doing that, and it's like, okay, so what I'm going to do after we get done, because you're right, the feeling the fool, that was a big thing for me over the past year or so, like kind of thing. But
it has been for me.
And being that I started going there and it was like, nope, that's okay. We can talk about other things. Right?
Well, and for me, I found that it stemmed from that judgment of I was better than that.
Mm-hmm. Which is right.
Which is that hierarchy and that,
hierarchy. Yes, yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yes. And so the thing is, and I love that in the Jungian psychology is like the where to look for it is the shame. Like, what am I ashamed about within myself?
Right.
Because that's essentially that's what we do with the shadow, is what we're ashamed of, we hide.
And I think something you said to me yesterday in a text is like, but what if that's where your strength lies and you're simply just covering it up?
Yep.
To go play in this.
Right.
The lack, the less than. And if you take that moment and dust off all of that, all of your shadow stuff, what if that's where you find your strength? And, I don't even want to use the word power because a lot of people have judgments surrounding that. But if that's where you find your passions, that's where you find
your purpose
and your authentic essence.
Yes.
What if that's where it is?
Yes. Yeah. Well, and we've said for years that we've gotten that the deepest truths are hidden in plain sight. And to me, that would be the shadow. Right. So,
and it's not like you have to go on a long, laborious journey to find who you really are. You have all the information. It's just a question of looking at it with that observation and acceptance and an unconditional acceptance of whatever it is you see.
Mm-hmm. Because, the first thing you're going to do is look at why I feel ashamed, right? What made me feel ashamed of this, and what's really underneath it, because it really sometimes takes 5, 6, 7, 10 steps to get there because you've hidden it in so many layers, right? This is not an overnight thing. It's not something you do on a Saturday afternoon, because this is what drives us so deeply. Right. I mean, this is what we do continuously. And for years, you and I have been doing shadow work, and it's still hitting us right between the eyes. Right. So, I mean, last year was a huge year of shadow work for me, and I still have stuff that's coming up. Right. And when we were talking about it Friday, like all weekend, I've been like, okay, I'm going to commit myself to seeing this. Cause you know what hit me? And when we were talking, when I called you, it was like, in this moment of like in a moment of quietude, this is what the importance of meditation is, and being able to clear your mind. I was literally just walking by myself. and it was just this little tiny voice that was like, this is how I came into this life. This was a chip I had on my shoulder that I've never let myself see before. And then all of a sudden it was like, ba-tink, ba-tink, ba-tink. It was like a domino effect. Like all of a sudden I could see so many things. And I was like, it was that one little voice that said, remember this. And then the feeling came in, and then I was like, oh, wow. Right. And that twisted everything back into perspective versus all the things I've been denying myself or calling myself victim to or whatever. And I was like, oh no, this was all my creation. It was all on purpose. It was very purposeful. And as soon as I could see it in the bigger picture, I was like, oh, look at how powerful I am.
Right. Right. And if you can keep that perspective and turn it around to that self-responsibility, which is
and all right. And that was right, the whole course, right? But it was me being able to stay out of judgment. So I judged it I let myself judge it for about 20 minutes. And then I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I saw that. Blah. Like I sent you the whole puking emoji. And I'm like, you know, I just want to puke all that up. But then once it came up and I looked at it and I was like, I sort of laughed to myself like, wow, that's so brilliant.
Right. We're so creative in fooling ourselves.
Right. So creative. And so it took me, that was Friday. I think it was Saturday morning. It took me till Saturday morning for me to even talk to my husband about it, because then it included him and our interactions and all that kind of stuff. And I said, well, this is my big epiphany yesterday. And I went through and I was telling him, and at that point I had no shame, no anger about it. I was like, look at how brilliantly I did that. And then he was like, because then of course, then he could see it in himself. And I said, and the funniest thing is, the one thing I have always ridiculed you about since we have known each other for 30 years is the biggest thing that I have done to myself in my life. I said, how funny is that? Ha ha. Right.
Right.
And so, and I'm like, except I hid it from myself, but I had to marry somebody that was just going to put it in my face and put it in my face and put it in my face and put it in my face until I finally saw it. So thank you. Right. 30 years later.
Better late than never.
But then it was, okay, well, now I see it. What am I gonna do with it? Now I want to see it. I want to see it in its fullness. I want to see it in its fullness as I have played it out, so that I can understand it and understand myself better. Right. And so that's what I'm still processing through. And it's like, wow, that one little thing, that one little voice that brought in everything, that little tiny key. And it all came from my commitment to say, well, I'm going to let it come up. I'm going to let the shadow visit all weekend and just sit with it. And let's have a chat, shall we, you know, and play a game. Shall we play a game?
Right.
But so it's very cathartic. And now it's like a part of me just wants to go sit in meditation for like, you know, like the whole week, going, okay, let's work with this and see it all and put it all together in a nice little bow with gratitude for being able to see it finally. Right. But this is the working through the shadow. This is all of the other work that we talk about, coming to self-love. Self-love is the key. And the more we focus on self-love and being able to get out of the judgment. And of course, we have a whole course on self-love too. But the more we get the more we get into self-love and we get out of the judgment and more into self-acceptance, the more then we start to let ourselves see these things. Like I saw so much over this weekend that I probably would never have let myself see 5 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
Obviously I did.
Almost to a different level, whether instead of just skimming the surface, it was like deep dive. Absolutely.
And so, and it's not that it's oh, there's the yawn. It's not that it's it takes us a long time because that's what we run ourselves by. And in fact, it goes back to talking about the masculine, feminine energy, and the masculine built in separation and creation through separation. Well, we created the shadow through that energy, right?
Right.
So, and it's not bad. The shadow is not bad. We've made it to be bad because we're afraid of it, because it's what controls us.
Right. And you can't have one without the other. We've talked about that so many times, that the dark is defined by absence of light, and the light is defined by absence of darkness. They define each other.
Yeah.
They create each other, in other words.
Yes. Yes. So the more we commit ourselves to wholeness, like we talk about oneness all the time in the spiritual community, but truly what Sarah and I have talked about for a long time here is the wholeness is so important, because we deny ourselves. So even if we took it away from masculine, feminine, we just made it light and shadow, right?
Right. Just like the yin and yang.
Right. We cannot deny ourselves the shadow, because it's actually what we believe is one of the most beautiful parts of this level of density and these dimensions, because it's what has created such a texturous, saturated experience when we're embodied here. Yasmin says totally. Yeah, so that kind of weekend for me as well. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, so that is where, when we talk about shadow work, that is like, you can just focus on shadow work, but we don't feel comfortable with that. We don't like talk about shame, right? How many people call themselves light workers, but how many people call themselves dark workers?
It's getting more, but how about oneness workers?
Wholeness workers, right?
Right.
Like
we talk about whole foods or whole paycheck, but what about whole person?
Right.
Whole
consciousness.
Whole consciousness. Yeah. There's just
whole being, right? We were talking last week about the being.
Right.
Doing for being.
And you aren't fully being until you allow this shift in your thinking, and the shift in your beliefs of what being really is, because being is actually all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Not just that I judge worthy of me being.
Yeah. It was funny this morning. My husband did something and I was bussing on him because it was very out of his character. And he's like, well, okay, excuse me for being human, right? So we always say human being, but really it's the being human, and the human being is the living in separation from wholeness, but in separation, in wholeness, in separation. And it's like, we either typically talk about one or the other, but now it's time for us to allow both.
Right. All of it.
Right. So today, our meditation, our energy session here will be, I think, inviting the shadow out to play, right? To have not even play, just, well, maybe we can play a game of chess. I don't know. Inviting the shadow out to have a chat in acceptance and non-judgment, right? Complete acceptance, to say, okay, where is it? And if you want to look at, if you want to look at it from the non-woo-woo side, I mean, there is no non-woo-woo. It's all the same, right? Psychology, you can call it psychology, you can call it consciousness and spirituality. It's very connected. It's like, okay, what am I ashamed of?
Right.
Exactly. What am I so like, and maybe we set ourselves to say, okay, I'm going to set myself to see to visit with the shadow this week, not just today, let's say this week, right? And in love and acceptance and gratitude, and hold that space to allow myself to see what it is that I have not been able to see within myself that drives me unconsciously, right? So that I can come to authenticity, authentic resonance within myself. and to allow myself the space, just the holding space of the visit, right? Just in your mind, if you want to see it as a visit and personify it, we're going to hang out together. And
I'm going to be present with it. Just like
I'm
we
going to
talked
really
about
get to know you this week. I'm going to really get to know my shadow this week. And I'm going to do it with love, right? While you're watching all the horror movies, or, you know, doing bump in the night, or, you know, whatever, doing spooky things. Do that with yourself. Do that with your shadow, and give it the respect and love that it deserves. So that's what we'll do. We'll hold ourselves in that space to allow it to come up with love and gratitude, you know, in a way that is palatable and easy to comprehend and see, you know, what's been driving you unconsciously, right? And to be able to accept that, you know, free of judgment, so that, and to conscious understanding of how to shift that to move beyond it. How's that? That's a lot in one statement.
That's a lot.
It is a lot, but why not?
It's a place to start.
The place to start. All right. So everybody take a deep breath, close your eyes. As we step out of separation, back into wholeness and oneness. And we hold ourselves at the vibration where that is our truth. That is from where we exist, create, and experience. All right. Oh, I could have stayed out there all day.
Right.
It was so interesting because it's like funny how the energy changes like around Halloween and people are like, oh yeah, okay, I'll just take it out and dust it off, right? And it's like it was like I was sitting on the front porch with my shadow, right? And having a glass of wine together, and and then I started seeing these things, and it was like they were like rotten pumpkins, right? And they had like maggots in them or whatever. And I basically was like, go ahead, reach in the shadow. And I was like, but it's Halloween. Of course I'm going to reach in because it's Halloween, right? Because I can do that. So I did. And then I pulled out this like golden nugget, which I always talk about the golden nuggets, right? And it's like, oh, and it was like, okay. And then like there were different things like scorpions. And what made me think of like that, there was a TV show for a while and they made people do stuff like their deepest fears or whatever,
Right. Yeah.
It was just like, yeah, well, you either accept the illusion as it is, or you can just grab that out of there, right? So I was like taking stuff out, and it was like a diamond or different things, and it was like all representative different parts of myself, and I was like, oh, this is going to be a fun week, and it was just so fun. It was like it was so much more acceptable, right? And then it was
Right.
like, yeah, so then for us to be able to do it collectively is even more important, but the most important part is our own stuff first, right?
Right. Yeah.
It was like, so I was seeing that, and then it was like everybody had their own pumpkins, and then everybody had whatever, and then it started to, bubble out, and then I was like, oh, I can just do this all day. This feels so good because it felt like such a relief.
Right. From holding up a facade. Yeah.
Mm.
Mine was very zodiac oriented, which is, not something that I practice or dwell on a lot, but I find that I define myself and my predilections. Oh, well, I'm a Libra. Everything's, I crave that balance. I crave that because I don't want to say you never, but I typically never see the scales of Libra unbalanced. They're always pristine, clean, usually empty or else equally balanced.
Mhm.
And it was like going back to asking my question, what am I ashamed of? And it's like I have struggled and grew up in a household that struggled with, it had to be clean, it had to be neat for others to see, and that you sacrificed everything to keep it that way, even though your natural tendency was not that. So it kept you in that constant strife of that battle. And I kept saying, but I'm a Libra, it should be this way. And I saw those scales, with the one flipped over, the chains all askew, everything. Right. And it just made so much sense, because it doesn't always have to be that way. And that I spend so much of who I am in keeping that facade, keeping that balance when, everything ultimately is in balance, no matter what it looks like.
Well, and underneath it is, well, maybe you like being a little dirty. Like there's nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely.
Right?
And that's, you've got to get your, cooking, you got to get your hands dirty.
Right.
You've got to get in there. Every creative aspect,
Yes,
has a little bit of destruction mixed in.
Yep. Right. And if you avoid that because you think it's shameful or bad, right?
Right.
Then you
Just
never
like if we had a campaign to save the caterpillars, we'd have no butterflies.
Right. Right.
Because it's got to go through that process of breaking down to recreate. So that's what mine was filled with, and so much gratitude and aha moments of, oh, I see why the thing I've railed against and struggled against is actually right here for me. It's the gift.
Right. And then the next question is, well, what if I did let it just be dirty and destructive?
Right. And that's when
unashamedly, like unapologetically.
that's when
Yeah.
the big breath came in of, oh God, that's so much easier.
Yeah, right. It's like, oh, you mean I can do that?
Right.
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 Yeah. And that's what we're talking about, is there's so many layers to that, right? Like what's under that and what's under that and what's under that.
It's just, and okay, so open the door just a little bit,
Right.
just a little bit. And
Journal,
right.
please. Yeah. Because these thoughts come up, and then it's when you write them down sometimes, if you're not used to processing this stuff, it's like sometimes I find when I write stuff down in my journal, like I see it differently when I see it in writing, and then I'm like,
Or when I come back and revisit it and go, that feels totally different now.
Right. Right. All right. So a little playing for this week, and please share, like, and share, with those. Share, I mean, I think it's the time of the shadow right now. It's the time for the shadow to come to not just today, not just this week,
not just Halloween.
Not just Halloween. It's time for us to, and it's funny because, when we were talking about this Friday, it was like, oh yeah, because it was in October of last year, we actually launched the shadow module of our program, the shadow course. So yeah, play with it this way. And, please like and share, because this, like we said, I mean, I know we say all this stuff is really important, but the shadow stuff, that's really key. And we tend to blow over it because we're not comfortable with it. Right. And what I saw collectively when we went out there too was, oh, everybody loves to be uncomfortable. It's like you're uncomfortable with it. And so in Halloween, it's okay to be openly uncomfortable with it, but love it at the same time. So it's like, so let yourself sit with that. Have a glass of wine or a beer with it, or smoke a doobie with it, like
right.
Do some bonding time with your shadow, because it's a part of you. And the more you do that, the more it'll start to meld back together. And that you then, like I said, when I was able to start seeing a lot of my motivations through my entire life as a completely opposite as what I thought they had been.
Right.
And I was like, it took me a hot minute, because I was like wanting to judge. But then when I sat with it and I just sort of looked at it without judgment, I was like, wow, that's pretty brilliant. Look at how brilliant I am.
Exactly.
I fooled myself for 53 years. It's awesome.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so play with that this week. Please like and share. Follow us on social media, and come back next week. And please, this week, put in here on the comments, like what you're going through, like how you're doing with your shadow, because we want to hear. Because we want to do this together. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you might not be the only one who's having that same experience. So if you put something out there, somebody else may go, oh, me too.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so everybody have a great Halloween. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. This is Angela Coulter and
Sarah Sieg Evagnoni
signing off with this week's Ascended World. Have a great one, everyone.